Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrell Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Michael Turton. Michael grew up in the United States and has lived in Taiwan for over 30 years. There, he teaches and writes about Taiwanese history, politics, culture, and his life as an expat. You can read over a decade of Michael's writings at his blog called The View from Taiwan, and his regular column in the Taipei Times called Notes from Central Taiwan. Mr. Michael Turton, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for this opportunity. I've been looking forward to it.
I read that I heard rather that you grew up in a town called Indiana, Pennsylvania.
Actually, I grew up in Ann Arbor. I only went to high school in Indiana, and I got out as quickly as I could. Yeah. I went to college there. No, I shouldn't say that. I went to college there, and then I left, and I haven't really been back. I couldn't even tell you anything about the town now. Yeah. So after that, I went into Peace Corps. I was in Kenya from the end of 1986 until the beginning of 1989. I think it was like 28 months. And then I traveled across India, and it was in India where I encountered Taiwan. That was 1989, and I took a boat trip in Mumbai, in the harbor there, right, to the cave island. I think it's called Elephanta. And on a boat with us was a crew from, I think, from one of the Taiwan TV stations, and they were shooting the harbor. And the Indian guy was like, "Don't shoot that. That's a top secret ship. Don't shoot that. That's this, that. But you can do this." And so I asked them where they were from because I thought Japan, right? And they said, no, Taiwan. That was my first encounter with Taiwan, right? And then a few weeks later, we were at the Taj Mahal, and these Canadian guys were there. And they were like, "Oh, you got to go to Taiwan. The food is great. The money's good. The women are beautiful." And I always end that with, everything was a lie. I always say that in Chinese. But no, but that's actually what they said. They really liked the life there. And then got back, ran into my old high school roommate, my old high school friend. Sorry, he's a polymath working on AI now at UCST. And he said, "I'm going out to Taiwan to study Mandarin for a year. Why don't you come with me?" I said, "Okay." And that was how I wound up here. Basically been here since 1989.
When did you decide that you would be staying in Taiwan?
No one ever decides.
It just happened.
No one decides. This is the island of the lotus eaters, okay? You eat the lotus, and then one morning you wake up and 10 years have gone by. And then, your connections are here, your life is here, your kids are here, your wife is here, everything's here. You know how that is, right? When you're an expat. And if you go back, you start over. And you can't really go back because the US is there's the healthcare issue, right? What do I do about healthcare? Here, NHI. So I never went back. And Taiwan is like this moment right now. For Taiwan is just an amazing place to live. It's safe. You can get plastered and sleep on a bench in the park and no one will molest you, which actually sucks because at my age, that's the only way I can get molested. And then seriously, you can as a woman, you can walk around safely at all hours of the night. No one will bother you. There's very few countries where you can say that. There aren't any guns. Things are orderly. When they break down, they're fixed right away. Life is super convenient. I mean, this is a very wonderful time, this last 10 years or so, to be in Taiwan as far as living standards and the experience of living in Taiwan. It's really a great place.
Let's go over some of that trajectory of your time there and talk about how things have changed. So you said you first arrived there in 89, so you spent the early 90s in Taiwan. How were people talking about politics at that time compared to the way things have changed in the 21st century?
Well, in 1989, people were very circumspect in their discussions of politics because people often say, "Oh, 1987, martial law lifted." But that's not actually the case. Right after they lifted martial law, they passed a national security law that was basically martial law in all but name. And a lot of the dissidents stayed in jail until 1992, 93. I think the last one was released in 93. People didn't talk about politics. And of course, I was 26. I didn't know anything. I didn't speak any Chinese, not much Chinese. Not until the second year. I was more interested in working. I worked like a dog, 60 hours a week. At that time, the NT was 23 to the dollar at one point. after the Plaza Accords, right? The NT had been fixed at 40, and then after the Plaza Accords, it went off the fix, and it rose to 23 to the dollar briefly. And then, of course, it eventually worked its way back to 30. And that's where the government says it's not trying to keep it, but where it actually keeps it between 30 and 32 until the recent round of tariff things. So in Taiwan, I just made a ton of money. You know, I was teaching English, I was working with kids, I was young, I was surrounded by young, beautiful people, men and women. And I got a job at a cram school, and the owner there was very open. So we had a Filipino teacher, we had an Algerian teacher who was a British citizen, and he spoke 8 or 9 languages, wrote 2 master's degrees, one in Russian, one in Chinese, you know, just full of interesting people. And they all went on to do stuff. And then, you know, I was there in Taipei before the metro was built. So I actually did some of the translation work in my second year there for the French company that was putting in the Brown Line. So things changed over time. As you probably know, during the 1990s, people began to realize, you know, I'm not going to get imprisoned for saying stuff. The whole idea of democracy took root, and then people started revealing their real identities. So in about a decade, you know, the population just shifted. If you ask people in 1980, they'd say, "Oh, I'm Chinese, I'm Chinese," and then bang, suddenly they revealed their actual preferences, which was, "I'm Taiwanese." And you know, in the 1990s, you sat down at a table, you're having dinner with 8 people, and there'd be like one really pro KMT guy pontificating, and I know 6 other people at the table were deep green, but they wouldn't say anything. They would just let him talk, because everyone was in the reflexive habit of not speaking. And then about 2010, that shifted so that the people in the KMT finally, the people who were deep blue began to experience themselves as a minority, and in fact, as a tiny minority. So one of the issues that the KMT has never really grappled with is this post-colonial minority status, right? Where it's a former colonial state, and now its supporters are the minority. 2010, 2011, 2012, this started to shift, and the KMT people experienced themselves as a minority and wouldn't talk. And I saw this in my class. I taught a current events class at 2 colleges, right? And so in the 2007, 8, 9 period, I'd say, "Oh, you know, the Senkakus are really Japanese. They're not Chinese, and they've never been Chinese." And there would always be some KMT kid, "No, that's wrong." And he'd come and argue with me after class. And then after about 2011, that stopped. I never got any more deep blue kids raising their hands. So it's been really fun to watch this change. It's been wonderful to watch Taiwan grow. And it's been wonderful to watch people be able to speak and do all the crazy things that they always wanted to do, but couldn't because of the regime.
Do you look back at anything about those times with some nostalgia or fond memories, those early years?
Yeah, I do. It was a lot more Wild West, a lot more anarchic. People, you know, now everything's very orderly. You go to Taipei. This is one reason I don't live in Taipei, because there's still some small strains of anarchy in Taichung. And so that and the weather are why I don't live in Taipei. But it's become very orderly, and in those days it wasn't. And so, for example, I had a visa back then, and you could get a visa to study English. So what you did was you got your girlfriend to write that she was your English teacher, and then you could stay for 6 months. You had to leave every 60 days. You just had to leave. So I would fly to the transit lounge in Hong Kong and kill 4 hours with a book and then fly back. And that's how you kept your visa. You had to do that every 6 months. That's what it was. And all that everything was illegal in Wild West. There were the MTVs. People probably told you about those. That's where you took a girl, because you couldn't take her home. And in those days, things were more conservative. So you took her to this MTV where you got a private room with a movie, but the purpose was so that you two could be alone. It was those are the things I miss, and the cheap prices. Now it's so easy to get around and do anything you want to do except bank.
It's one of the last frontiers of convenience, the banking for foreigners.
It's a running joke among all the foreigners here. Yeah, it's a running joke. We always say, "I'm going to the bank. Thoughts and prayers, please." Or I'm going to the bank, tell my children I love them, right? Because they take so long to do everything. And it takes four or five trips. So we have all these running jokes with banking.
You got involved with a group called the Taiwan Independence Movement. How did you get involved working
Well,
with them, and what kind of work did you do for them?
well, the independence movement wasn't really a group. It was like it was the goal of a lot of different groups, many of which hated each other. And I got a job when I came back in 1991 to the U.S. I went to George Washington and did a master's, and I worked there for a while. I worked for the Center for Taiwan International Relations, which was the World United Formosans for Independence group on Capitol Hill. And then they were next door to FAPA, the Formosan Association for Public Affairs, which is far more well known and deservedly so. But WUFI was like the radical wing. They were the guys who had set up the assassination of Jiang Jingguo when he visited the United States in 1970. That was my experience of the movement, and it was simultaneous. I became both brainwashed and disappointed. And there was a lot of, you saw, because you were inside, you saw a lot of the dark side, the infighting, the ego struggles, the pointless expenditure of resources on things that could not possibly work, right? All the things that were negative about it, but also all the positive, the way it brought people together, the way people were willing to work hard and sacrifice their dreams and their visions of Taiwan. There were really two movements, two eras. The first era is all the people who were either sent into exile in the 1960s or imprisoned and then released and left. And then there was a second set, young people who had come, whose formative experience was the 1979 Human Day on December 10th, 1979, when the KMT sicked gangsters on protesters. They chased around a bunch of leaders of the protests who eventually became the Kaohsiung Eight. They were tried. Their lawyers were Chen Shui-bian, the future president, Su Zhenchang, who's the heavyweight inside the DPP, and I think Frank Xia also, who became a presidential candidate. So the movement originally was all these different people working in disparate ways. And then in 1986, the DPP was founded, and it gathered up these people who called themselves the Dangwai outside the party, right? Gathered in all these people, most of them, some reluctantly, some enthusiastically, but basically they formed this big tent. And it's been plagued by factions ever since. But then it became run the next generation is what happened. And then finally by the people like Tsai Ing-wen who'd come out of the bureaucracy, right? Mm-hmm. So I've watched this whole evolution, and I was in at the beginning basically, and it's been a fascinating to observe this happen.
When I look back at some of this history, I think the mid-90s, when democratic systems were being formed, was important. But for me, the pivotal moment is 2000, where there's a peaceful transfer of power. What was it like being in Taiwan and watching that history happen?
We were euphoric. I mean, it was wonderful. And we went down to Guantian to congratulate Chen Shui-bian's mom to their hometown. The tough thing to deal with, and one of the reasons why I eventually started the blog, was the international media reaction to Chen Shui-bian. Oh my God, here's this wild man, a radical, an extremist, doesn't know anything, blah, 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 blah. Chen was a marine insurance lawyer. He was a corporate lawyer. So he had been doing some kind of marine law, as I recall. And then he was also one of the lawyers with the Kaohsiung Eight. And that's why he became famous and well known. And when that was the moment when the transition to democracy was solidified, right? The KMT could easily have won if they had a lick of sense. If they'd run James Sung, who came in second, if they'd run James Sung, they would have won, but they didn't. They wanted to run one of the Lian Jan wanted it, and he ran twice, and both times Chen Shui-bian beat him. So that was the moment when everything was solidified and we could have real Taiwan-centered politics, which was fantastic.
Over the years, as you're experiencing all of this, what were some important things that you learned along the way, perhaps books that you read? How did you learn to do what you do?
One thing is I became a blogger at the time. Google, do you remember the Google Reader app? You
I don't
could
think so,
get
no.
the what was that, the API off of news agencies. But there used to be an app called Google Reader, and you just
Uh,
clicked on whatever, the China Times, the New York Times, and you put this in the reader, and then all of the articles on the topics that you wanted would be right there, and you could just read them. And so that was one super important tool in keeping up. I used to read the Chinese papers a lot. I don't read them so much anymore. Local politics, now Donovan Smith does that. My good friend Corny Donovan Smith, he writes very, very fine grained stuff on that. So I've stopped. But during the blog days, that was it. I was it, basically. I was the only non-media, right, voice out there that until after about 2014, after the sunflower, then a lot more people started moving in. And then the reporters were kicked out of China, and now we have really good coverage of Taiwan from really sympathetic reporters, a lot of whom, like, for example, Chris Horton, former New York Times, he's a freelancer, and he wrote a book, and it's great. And that was very unusual. Back in Chen Shui-bian era, the coverage was awful, and it was hard to get information. It was quite often, it was very difficult to get information. Without the internet, I couldn't have done it, right? I mean, you can't go down to the 7-Eleven and buy 20 papers every day and then read them. That will take your whole day. I have full-time jobs. But I read a lot of books. My master's was under Bob Sutter. I don't know if you know who he is. He used to be the Congressional Research Service Taiwan desk officer. And for a while, he was also the CIA desk officer for Taiwan. And he knew where all the bodies were buried, and he was a great teacher. I don't think I ever heard an opinion from him in 2 years. And he was very formative for me. I read a lot on the informal financing methods. For example, you can't understand Taiwan manufacturing from, say, 1960 to 1990 without understanding the post-dated check. If I'm buying something from you, like material or inventory, whatever, I give you a post-dated check. And the thing about the post-dated check was this: it's a money loan, but it's a criminal violation if you don't pay it, not a civil one, which means that you have a post-dated check and you haven't paid. I have your check and you didn't pay. I can take it to the police and they will enforce the debt. And so post-dated checks became super important in this SME economy that no longer exists. It moved to China in the 90s. But that's what I really got interested in, was this small and medium enterprise. How do these guys get technology? How do they develop it? How do they learn about things? And it turns out, so I read all this stuff. So my enter point into Taiwan society and culture was the SME networks. So I read stuff like Lamb's article on guerrilla capitalism. You, son, you're going to go to the university in the United States. Do you know why? So that you can find out what they're buying so that we can sell it to them in the United States. And that's exactly what happened in the 70s. Remember when AT&T was deregulated? And then those idiotic phones, those big clunky phones, they could be made by anyone. Well, they all got made here. All those sons who were in the United States said, hey, they've deregulated AT&T. We need to be making this stuff. They switched from toys or plastics or whatever they were doing. And when the Hsinchu Science Park opened, people think of that as a kind of starting point, but actually that was sort of a little later than the start. There were already 50 to 100 computer firms ready to move in, and hardware and all that other stuff. So these guys had set up these sensitive networks that extended across to their main market, the United States. And people forget at that time, of course, that until Ronald Reagan in January of 1989 took Taiwan off the list, it was on a special list for developing economies, which means it had a separate tariff. So yeah, that was my entry point to understanding Taiwan. So I read all that stuff. A formative book for me was Lee Teng-hui, Lee Teng-hui, the president. His PhD thesis he went to Cornell, got a PhD, and his PhD thesis is on, it's called Intersectoral Capital Flows in the Economic Development of Taiwan, 1895 to 1960. So it compares the Japanese period and the KMT period. And it shows flows between the manufacturing and agricultural sectors, right? So the Japanese basically set up this thing where they control the price of rice. You keep the price of rice low. They also control the price of fertilizer. So you keep the price of fertilizer a little high, and that difference is what you extract from the population, right? So that difference, that ratio in the Japanese period was like about 1.2, as I recall. In the KMT period, it's 1.6. In other words, the KMT was way more extractive than the Japanese. And that's why they're so hated down south by those old farmers, because they can all remember when they had to buy a certain kind of fertilizer, even though they couldn't use it, right? So this was reading all these books, I began to understand. And when you read Li Donghui's PhD thesis, it's just this dispassionate account until you realize that it's a savage condemnation of KMT agricultural policy. And that's why he was brought back to Taiwan by Jiang Jingguo.
In your most recent piece, you talked about small, medium enterprises, how that's been on the decline for many years.
Yeah, those small businesses used to be powerful force for Taiwan nationalism. But then in the 90s, they all moved spate of factory fires. What they do is burn their factories, collect the insurance money, and then use that as seed money for the factory in China. And the Chinese brought them in. If you read Shelley Rigger's book on it, the Taiwanese played a key role in China's development. Then around 2010, that they began to clamp down, and it became difficult for Taiwan firms to make money. And you can see the articles, the scholarly articles on this changed their tone. The golden age was until about ECFA, from about 1995 until about 2011, when ECFA was passed and signed and came into effect. And then everything changed. During the Chen Shui-bian era, Taiwan ran a huge surplus with China, absolutely enormous. But what happened was all those small businesses moved there, right? So that had several effects. I often talk about this. For young men, if you were in the SME network world, right? Say you lived down in Hemei and you made socks. Your dad's factory made socks. So that's what you did. And you started out, you used your dad's guanxi, you got machines, right? You hired people and you yourself worked in it. So you came up through this. Well, the thing is, above you, there's an older male and he's mentoring you. Here's how you behave in the system. Here's how you behave in society. Here's how you act like a man. All that was going, that left, all that structure left. And remember, at the same time that occurred, the military service became shorter. Military service was how young males all acculturated, right? I mean, it was a terrible experience, but it was an experience they all had to get. And all that stuff that had provided structure for men slowly vaporized. And the businesses that moved to China, they smothered the growth of new competing businesses in Taiwan. They didn't want competitors to arise here. So there's that issue. Then we have, today we have what they call zombie firms. The government heavily subsidizes water, electricity, labor, and land in complicated ways. For example, they don't do anything about illegal factories on farmland. So firms can stay alive because they live on these subsidies, but they can't expand, and they can't do R&D because they can't get the capital to do it, right? They don't know whether they're going to be around tomorrow, so why should they invest in that? So there's a large number of SMEs, but only a tiny fraction of them actually produce, like what was it, like 6% produce 90% of revenues or something. It's just a tiny, there's a tiny fraction of them. I had the numbers in one of my pieces, I forgot. But basically, a tiny fraction of these firms of service firms, that's what it is, produces most of the value. And the other people who are in services are basically trapped there. If you don't have tech, finance, or English, you're screwed. You don't have a future. And so if you were really good, you could get into TSMC, but now that's going to disappear. That well is going to dry up, I think, in this decade. TSMC in 10 years is going to look very different. Because all those engineers now, what do they want to go into? They're really into quality of life. So they're like, I'm not going to work 70 hours a week. I'm not getting out of bed at 2 a.m. to fix some machine in your factory at TSMC. Why would I do that when I can make the same salary working, 8 to 5 in an AI firm? So things are going to change. And the other thing is a lot of those firms, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, with the decline of the small and medium enterprises, can we attribute any of it to the decline in population rate plus education and the fact that maybe some parents don't want their children going into the same line of work that they did anymore? That there's been changes like that
Yeah,
in
there's a
society
lot
too?
of factors like that. Yeah. The SME revolution, the SME evolution was driven by the existence of a huge network of vocational technical schools, right? So you could learn to operate a lathe, you could learn how, and then later they would teach you how to operate a CAD/CAM machine, right? So, you could use so people coming out of these things, they had two things. One is they had technical knowledge, and the other is their teacher was some old guy. And when the good students came out, they were like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to get you a job with my friend Achan over here. He needs someone who can run a 9-axis CNC machine. You know, he needs someone who can run an oil press and all that stuff." So there was a there was a there was a all of that people look at SMEs, but that's not enough. You have to look at the VOTEC places. So if you know the Taiwanese semiconductor firm, I think it's UMC. That firm was founded by 5 or 6 guys who'd all gone to the same VOTEC school, right? And that is gone. Chan Sui-bian wiped that out, and they upgraded all the universities, upgraded all the VOTEC schools to universities, except they're shit crap universities, most of them. And now they're all going to close. So that was one thing. There's in many industries that parents don't want their kids to go in, like construction. And in both ways, it's very low status, things like that. The SME world doesn't have the status that it used to. And now what's cool is what? Tech, crypto, AI, those things.
So if we zoomed out to a different vantage point, could we say that the economies and workforces are going through a major change, and there's going to be a very uncomfortable transition getting to whatever it's going to be in the futures?
I mean, Taiwan, this year we're going to have the lowest birth rate globally. Last month, and across this entire island of 23 million people, 8,400 babies were born. We're going to have less than 100,000 kids this year. That's 50,000 boys in 2043. Think about that, to join the army. There's nobody there. And the thing about a technological society is you need to have a population to sustain it. And if you look at cultures throughout history, when the population goes down, the tech base goes down. And the smaller it is, the less there is. So what we're trending towards right now is a collapse of about 94% of the population in the next 75 years. And there's no way that something like TSMC can operate in Taiwan. And the same thing's happening everywhere. Japan, you've been to Tokyo, and people extol Tokyo. This is urbanism. What a fantastic place to live. Have you looked at the birth rate there in 2023? The TFR was 0.9. Tokyo is not a solution to the world's problems. It's a necropolis. It's where the population of Japan goes to die. And it's the same here. And you look, I have a piece coming out this week on it, but basically the East Asian development model, I'll just go ahead and talk about it if you don't mind.
Of course. Yeah.
In China, Korea, Japan, and Singapore, of course, right? You export like crazy. And to a lesser extent, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, you export. And then at home, what do you do for an economy? You have land development. And what do you do for land development? Well, you build apartment buildings. And they all have different, it takes place in different ways. Like Korea is not the same as Japan. It's not the same as Taiwan. They're all different. But the end result is the same. The domestic economy runs on construction and infrastructure and apartment buildings. And the result is that it's a suicide pact. At home, you put up apartment buildings, and density of apartment buildings is inversely related to the TFR. The higher the density, the lower the birth rate, basically. And so you look at like Busan in Korea, the interior of that city, the TFR is 0.32. That means there will be no people in 50 years, right? Shanghai's 0.6 or 0.7. I have a list of these. But basically this pattern in East Asia, it's exaggerated here because there's no immigration because of the racism of East Asians. But it's the same, even you look at a place like Sydney or Melbourne, the interior of Sydney, the TFR is below 1. Out in the suburbs, it's 2. The suburbs are replacing themselves, but where there's apartment buildings, there's no babies. But you look at other places, they can't get there are policies that will get birth rates up, but for that to happen, the political economies will have to change. And of course, that isn't going to happen. Land developers aren't going to give up their grip on the economy. And so when I look at Taiwan after so many years here, I just think, well, you've decided to commit suicide and I can't stop you. Taiwan is my friend that is in a deep depression and will soon kill himself. There's nothing I can do for him. So I think what will happen is we're going to get an economy in, say, 20 years where the Russians and the Indians together are building semiconductors, because the Indians are still going through that demographic bulge. Philippines is doing that too, but their government is so screwed up, they won't get anywhere. But they also are, Philippines is falling, the birth rate there is falling very rapidly. Same thing, densification. Densification is death on birth rates. I don't see the transition to more progress. I think that things are going to be that we are living in the twilight of something very great now. It's what this century is going to look more like the 17th than the 19th.
Let me ask you about something a little more upbeat. You've been cycling in Taiwan for a lot of years. I'm interested in your insights in how cycling around Taiwan has expanded or changed your relationship with the land and people there.
Well, I think it becomes you. People underestimate the relationship between the body and identity, I think. They always think that it's happening here, but as you cycle across Taiwan, you become Taiwanese. That's why one of the Taiwanese things that you're supposed to do is cycle on the island, climb Yusan, swim Sun Moon Lake. They're all physical activities that involve taking the body across the space, because the KMT did a lot of damage to Taiwan history. When I was a kid, my dad took me to Gettysburg and Manassas and Fort Michilimackinac, and all those places where you experience the history of the United States. That's how you experience your own identity, four-dimensionally. But in Taiwan, that history's gone. Dads don't take them out to Baguashan to see the big battle that was fought between the incoming Japanese and the remnant Hakka army up there. So, yeah, first of all, it's really made me Taiwanese. And you experience Taiwan in a completely different way. You go places where tourists don't go, and you meet people like we took a bike ride out of Dao on the East Coast climb up into the hills, climb up. You're at 700 or 800 meters, and up at there's an Aboriginal village or an indigenous village. I've always preferred the term Aboriginal, but they want to be called indigenous people. So there's an indigenous village up there. And then after that, there's nothing. There's a road and you can take it, but it's fallen off the cliff. So you bike in like half a meter of soil and then you can fall off the side of the mountain at any time. And it's really an amazing experience like that. When you cycle up Alishan, you cycle through the tea fields and you start to get, you experience the rhythm of the seasonal changes, the heat, the cold, the way the plants change, the way the tea is spoiled. There's a lot of runaways up in the mountains, runaway migrant workers. And you meet them and you can talk to them. One night we stayed at a place up in the tea farms in Chiayi. And there was a Vietnamese woman working there. And she must have been in her 30s, and she was a runaway. She didn't want to really talk about that, but she was willing to say, yeah, I work 7 days a week here. They never give me any rest. And that was a theme that's a theme across the comments from many migrant workers that I've met in the mountains, who can see a lot of the work that goes into keeping Taiwan rolling. So especially in the mountains, the roads are constantly being destroyed by landslides. It's constant. Everywhere you go on a bike, you run into landslides. I remember once I got in a taxi in one of the local areas, in one of the local communities here, And suddenly we drove a bit, and then suddenly the driver stops. And he's looking, and he's looking. I'm like, what are you looking at? And he said, look, it's a squirrel. I've never seen one before. He was like 50.
Really?
He'd never seen a squirrel. Yeah. There's no wildlife in the city areas. And the only wildlife is like really big cockroaches. So it was actually a pretty moving moment. But up in the mountains, of course, you see pheasants and all those weasel and ferret animals. And I've never seen a pangolin. That's the only thing I haven't seen. Deer, you can see them even in the coast. But you experience that. It becomes part of your identity. And everywhere you go, you talk with local people. You're constantly talking with local people, and they tell you about local stuff. But here's what's happening in our community, right? Here's why this is the way it is. Because you ask them, how come we can't take this road? Well, this dude decided he wanted to build a big house. Or, well, down in Pingdong, and you encounter a lot of history. Down in Pingdong one year, I was biking through the pineapple fields, and I hit an old Japanese airfield tower. It was just sitting there, and it was left over from Kato Airfield. And I looked up Kato Airfield, and that was where the Japanese had tested chemical weapons, and in addition to flying fighting aircraft out of the field. So it's stuff like that. You constantly run into. I bike with my friend Drew, and Drew's very, very interested in Taiwan local history and Taiwan indigenous history. He created the original wiki page, I believe, on Taiwan indigenous people, and it won an award. He's an amazing man, Drew Kerslake, and he will stop at tombs, cemeteries, whatever, and then read the tombstones, and they will tell you. You see someone whose name is Pan from Shandong. Well, nobody here is from Shandong. So what you're looking at is an indigenous person who adopted a fake ancestry, right? A fake kin network. And or you go to some of the local schools that were built in the Japanese era, and they list all of the principals, and you can see that the Japanese rotated the principals among a Hakka family, an indigenous family, and then a Han family, and then a local Hoklo family. So you see a lot of this stuff in you travel on your bike up north of here, and there's a belt of people named Lin, and there's another belt of people who are indigenous mixed with Hakka, right? And there's a lot of local like markers on temples and stuff. And that's what biking has done for me. It's really brought me into a deep connection with the land. Yeah.
Reading some of your stuff on cycling has made me very interested in taking it up here in Hokkaido. There are lots of great roads to do it here, lots of wide open spaces and terrain as well. So,
yeah. And it's easier there. You don't have our mountains.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You go up the side of Alishan, that's like a 17% grade for 5 or 6 kilometers. That is not easy.
I couldn't climb up there. There's no way I could do that.
I couldn't the first 2 times either, so I had to walk the last K.
I enjoyed reading your piece about some people in the DPP party who are trying to change names of roads or buildings, and you were talking about some of the hassles or pitfalls that can come from trying to do this. Would you mind saying a little about why they want to do this and what some of the troubles are associated with doing this?
No, it's quite complicated. The street names in Taiwan are set up to glorify the KMT. The main drag in every town is Zhongzhenlu, right? Named after Chiang Kai-shek. And Zhongshan, that's the other big one. And all these glorify ROC and KMT history. And in Taipei, the streets are actually a map of China. If you know Chinese geography, you know what street you're on or what street you need to find, how to find the street you need to find. So the streets are like a rough map of China. So basically, they're inherently colonial, and they're markers of a colonial state, just the same way the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta is a marker of English colonial power, or the presidential office in Taiwan has that sun, that rising sun, that sun character for Japan. So all these are colonial markers, and the DPP has spent a lot of time removing colonial markers. The KMT will then call this de-signification, but really it's reclaiming, right? The problem is that along with this colonial regime, there was a system of murder, torture, imprisonment, exile. During the martial law era until 1993. And no one has ever been tried for this. So first of all, when I see this renaming thing, I think this is hollow. Renaming is great and it has to happen, but first people have to do jail time. There has to be justice. The dead cry out for justice, and they have none. And I don't think they ever will be. The nuts and bolts issue with the street names is that to change the name of a street, you need a vote, basically, of all the local people. There's a formal process for it, and the majority have to agree to change. So changing a street name is really difficult. The previous mayor of Taichung, Hu Ziqiang, forced through a change in the name of the main drag by conducting a poll, and the residents said, "Yeah, okay," in the poll, and then he said, "Well, this poll is the same as a vote, so we'll change the name," and they did. So the DPP could probably do some end around like that, but but as I said in the piece, the amount of trouble, the hassle is unbelievable. So people have to change all of their IDs, right? And that will take ages. And then they have to file all that paperwork with all of their employers, with the associations. And then, for example, if you are in a nonprofit, the nonprofits are still regulated under the old security laws. So if you form a nonprofit, you have to have 25 people willing to give their ID, and to supply a copy of their ID to the government to show that this is a real thing with real people in it. Well, what happens when all these addresses are wiped out? What happens to all these places? There's many, many things that depend on stable addresses. Nothing, probably everyone will be flexible about it. But there's things like land titles. You change the names, all these contested land titles will reappear. So for many people, there's all kinds of possible fallout from this. And what's the upside? The DPP is not in the position where it can say, well, we're going to change the street names and look how well we've done with all the other things. The economy's doing well, but inflation is a mess. Housing prices are still amazing. Birth rates are not up. You could just list all the areas where there's been a lack of policy progress, to put it politely. So, water prices are too low, electricity prices are too low. It just goes on, the list goes on and on. Renewables not fast enough. So the DPP can't say, well, look at all the things we've done. Now let's do this. First, they have to do all those other things. They have to establish themselves, and then they can carry out this process of renaming. When Chen Shui-bian came in, he changed a lot of the names. He changed them back to what they were. China Shipbuilding used to be Taiwan Shipbuilding. The post office used to be the Taiwan Post Office, dating all the way back to the Manchu Empire. And so this is part, of course, of the rectification of names is an old historical process in Han culture. But it's not the time to do it right now.
When I was in Taiwan, I was asking people about the KMT and their modern vision in a democracy. What are they offering voters in contrast to what the DPP is to appeal to them? I didn't really see how they had evolved out of the previous periods to present a new vision in Taiwan's democracy. But one of the pieces from Courtney Donovan Smith recently wrote about the Taichung Mayor Lu Xiaoyan. She seemed like she has potential to be a strong candidate for the KMT in the future. Do you think so as well?
Well, Denver and I had a long talk about this because we're both quite interested in Lu. She's very centrist on the one hand. She's the mayor of Taichung, which is the second largest city. So that gives her a base. And she's shown that she's capable of learning. When her first year was pretty rocky, but then she settled down. The public doesn't hate her, and that's always good. But the difference between the KMT and the DPP is that at the local level, the KMT is very connected to the local factions. So if you want something done, they will get it done. right? So the KMT has the reputation of being the party that gets things done. And the thing about the DPP is that's the party that wants change. Well, people don't really like change, right? If we start enforcing the law, does this mean my illegal rooftop floor will be removed? Will I have to lose my illegal balcony construction? A lot of people construct out their balconies, right? There's a lot of illegality. And if you start enforcing the law, ordinary people are going to lose. So that's always an issue. If you really want to make change in the housing price, you have to change the tax system. And the KMT is clearly not going to do that, right? But the DPP is a threat to do that. So why should we vote for that? And the other thing is that the KMT, with its connections to the local factions, collects votes from people. I had a close friend who lived near me in Tanzania, and she was one of those people who, when Chun Swabian said, "There's no cap on the ocean, you mainlanders can just swim back. We don't care," right? When he said that, she was like, "Yeah, yeah, that's what we want to hear." And then election time comes around. Who are you voting for? I'm going to vote for Mr. Lin. He is so nice. She doesn't, a lot of them don't get this connection between that nice KMT guy and what's happening in their lives at the national level. So they still collect a lot of votes because they work really hard. The factions have worked hard in making connections locally. Sweet Mr. Lin would stand out there every day, guiding the kids across the busy street, at the main intersection there. So what a coincidence, everyone could see him there. They did a lot of things like that that were really smart. And a lot of the local factions feel like the KMT is the party that brought prosperity, and they can't understand how come we're not growing at 8% anymore. Isn't that possible? I'm like, you realize that 3% growth is like one standard deviation away from the average. You are not going to make 8% growth ever again. But they don't realize that. They can't. A lot of them, when Han Goy in 2020 ran on this platform of making everyone rich, he was running on that feeling. If the DPP and democracy weren't screwing things up, we could have 8% growth again, because that's what's really important. But of course, that moment of SMEs, US connections, artificially low NT, pressed labor. So the KMT has this reputation. They have the factional connections. They have politicians that have good local connections. But Lu's problem is that she will have to commit to the KMT ideological platform. One China, 1992 consensus, all this stuff. That's what happened to Ho Yo-i. He was not allowed to be himself. And I think the other issue with Ho was he did not know who he was. And I think we're going to find that same issue with Lu, because the KMT had Ho Yo-i. He was touted as the coming presidential candidate for 4 years. And what policy could he point to in New Taipei City that was, wow, this policy is amazing. What a great idea. Nothing. There was nothing radical or interesting or revolutionary, even evolutionary, even incremental. It's all the same. And Lu is in the exact same position. Hu Ziqiang, the KMT mayor from several iterations ago, he was going to shut down the center of the city and make it walkable. That's the kind of policy ideas that they would need to say, hey, look, we're different. But they don't. What they offer is the same. We're the same, and things are not going to change. We're not going to tax your house. You have an illegal factory on farmland? Fine. We're not going to do anything about it. That's why the previous DPP mayor got in trouble, because he did something about those illegal factories on farmland, because something had to be done. The KMT does not disturb the status quo, and that's how they stay in at the local level. But, you just saw just today they proposed, this week they proposed in the legislature a bill defining the sea between Taiwan and China as an internal sea, and Taiwan and China as one country, and removing jurisdiction away from the military and the Coast Guard to a civilian group. And also, that legislation would permit local governments to negotiate directly with Beijing. So the whole thing was to eliminate central government authority over this sensitive area off the coast of China and the nearby ocean. So what happens is Liu Xiaoyan is going to encounter this ideological terrorism. I don't know what to call it, but Liu Xiaoyan is going to have to come to grips with this, either put a stop to it or learn to live with it. And either one of those is going to affect her position.
There can't be a whole lot of people in Taiwan that would be in favor of what that legislator proposed, is there?
No, no, this is 18
It's,
people. Yeah, and most people would not be in favor of that. KMT and TVP.
you brought up the walking streets. Was it you I read 2 or 3 years ago who
Oh,
wrote a piece about Xi Ding and how that was turned into a walking street?
yeah,
Was that you who wrote that
walkable
article?
city.
Okay. Yeah, I liked that article.
It's a thing with me. I write about it every year, right? I'm hoping someone somewhere will listen, but so far, uh, so far,
Yeah,
no
well,
luck. You can just keep talking and hoping somewhere some change will occur.
well, on that note, let me just ask you a final question here. Over the next few months, what are some things that you're going to have your eye on going on in Taiwan or in the world related to Taiwan issues?
Yeah, drones. The coming Chinese invasion, which now I think a lot of people are seeing in the next 2 or 3 years. Um, Another is the slow erosion of TSMC by Chinese semiconductor firms. I think they're gonna slowly cut away at TSMC's lead. Another is inside Taiwan, the KMT evolution where, and Donovan has written on this, where the local factions are starting to take over the KMT. And another thing that I'll be looking, because the nuclear plants are closed. The Taipower's reserve margin that they always talk about is a construction intended to suppress the development of renewables. But hopefully that we can get some change there so that we have, that was one of the things when Tsai Ing-wen came into power. They wanted to reform Taipower, split it up into 4 companies, keep the pensions over here, because Taipower is in the Constitution. They can't get rid of it. But you split it up into production, distribution, and so on, and then you can reform it. Then you can recreate it. Along with that is the power grid. The power grid has to be hardened, and it has to be made resilient. So we're going to need all sorts of things, modular. You know, in Ukraine, the war has been fought over the power grid, and I've written on that. I wrote one of my pieces about that. But the power grid is people focus on nuclear power way too much. The real issue is the grid. I think you probably read in one of my pieces where in 1999, in July of 1999, one single pylon fell over, electrical pylon fell over, and the whole island was without power. The system is extremely centralized, so that if there's a problem somewhere, there's a cascade across the entire network and everything collapses. What the government is doing is trying to make the grid resilient, but really that resilience is isolating the science parks from the grid more thoroughly so that if the grid goes down, the science parks still have power. So production can keep going and going and going. But that's one thing I'll be watching. And finally, I'll be watching what happens with agriculture. It's a dying industry here. Literally, the average age of farmers is like 60 now. I'm sure Japan is the same. And the government is quite inflexible. Their thing now is assistive technology. Be working on farms at the age of 75. Nobody wants to do that, right? They might have a garden, but they're not going to be wandering around their rice farms. So those are some of the things I'm going to be looking at. And of course, migrant workers, what's going to happen with those?
I
So
look forward to keep reading your stuff in the Taipei Times, and I'm going to try and keep up with this stuff from afar as well. I've been falling behind a little bit the last couple of months, so I was really happy to have the opportunity to talk with you today. Thank you.
Sure, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for this opportunity.